This is the Biological Resources Information Program for the McHenry Avenue Corridor Improvement Project, provided by Alluvian Biological Consulting. The purpose of this training is to familiarize you with some of the regulated or listed species that may occur on the project site and to inform you on what to do if something like that happens over the course of the project. So let's get started. So you should all have a Biological Resources Information Program booklet or handout in front of you. It would be very helpful to follow along this presentation with the booklet. There's going to be 4 main points that we're going to try to get across over the course of this presentation. The first is the definition of take. The second is what to do when or if you encounter a regulated species on the project site. The third is an introduction to some of these regulated species. And the fourth are some of the general mitigation measures we can use to prevent any incident of take on a project site. So let's talk a little bit about take. Take is a very broadly defined term. California has a different definition for it than the federal government does, but they're both very similar. So for the federal definition, take means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. California's definition is to hunt, pursue, catch, capture, or kill, or attempt to do any such actions. They're very, very similar, and they both mean pretty much the same thing. Anything that constitutes harassment or more is going to qualify as take. And the reason that it's important for you to know what take is because take of listed or regulated species can carry some pretty hefty penalties. Criminal penalties can go as high as $50,000 and up to a year in jail time in some instances. And civil penalties can get almost as high as the criminal penalties financially. So it's incredibly important that you know what take is and you avoid take as much as you possibly can so you can avoid these penalties. So before I introduce you to some of these listed and regulated species that we might encounter on the project, the first thing we need to go over is what your responsibilities are if you see one of these species. First and foremost, do not touch or approach the listed or regulated species. Can't stress that enough. Second thing on the list, if the species is in the immediate project area and is at risk of being injured or killed, you need to stop work immediately. What needs to happen then is you need to notify the designated biologist or the biological monitor. If one of us isn't there, if the monitor is not present, you need to contact Alluvian Biological Consulting directly. The phone number is in each of your books, and it's here on the presentation. The principal biologist on this project is Gennaro Lockhart. Only a qualified and permitted biologist can handle and move regulated species from the project site. So here's a quick rundown of some of the species that we have in close proximity to the project site that carry with them some sort of protection. Some of them have federal protections, like the Central Valley steelhead and the longhorn beetle, and some of them have state protections, like SWAINSON'S hawk and pond turtle. There's also groups of animals here as well. So whole groups of animals like nesting and migratory birds, as well as roosting bats, have blanket protections for no matter what species they are. So this is a zoomed out aerial view of the project area. You can see running north to south, highlighted in yellow, is the McHenry Avenue Corridor project. And around this area you can see all these other colored shapes. Each of those shapes corresponds to an observation of a listed or regulated species within 5 miles of the project site. Now these observations don't necessarily mean that the animals are there currently. These are past observations and the animals might have moved since the observation has been made, but it's helpful to know what has been seen close by to the project so we figure out what to anticipate. So you can see from the map here that we have habitat for Valley elderberry longhorn beetle as well as observations of Central Valley steelhead on the project site itself. So that's important to know. It helps you anticipate what you might see over the course of the project. So let's take a look at some of the listed and regulated species on this project site. Your booklets will have more information than we'll cover here. I'm just going to try to give you a brief overview of each species. The first species we're going to talk about is California Central Valley steelhead. This is a member of the trout family, and in fact, it's the exact same species as rainbow trout. The only difference being that rainbow trout are going to spend most of their entire lives in freshwater, and steelhead will actually migrate out to the ocean to spend most of their lives in saltwater. This fish can get pretty large, up to 55 pounds and 44 inches in length, although most individuals never reach this size. Their dorsal coloration is going to be olive to dark brown, and that's going to gradually fade to this light silver on their underbelly. Their entire body is covered in these dark speckles, as you can see in the image. This particular population segment of steelhead, which inhabits the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River systems of the Central Valley, is designated as federally threatened, and that's for a combination of reasons, including habitat fragmentation due to dams being constructed in the river systems, loss of wetland habitat, as well as disease and other factors. There are species-specific mitigation measures for California Central Valley steelhead on page 11. Please read them. Valley elderberry longhorn beetle are a large black beetle with very long antennae. They have bright red wing coverings, and they also have some green coloration along their bodies. Their entire life cycle is dependent on elderberry plants. They lay their eggs on the bark, they burrow into the stems during their inactive period, they emerge when the plant blooms for their active period, and they feed on the plant itself. Their entire existence is dependent on elderberry plants. They've listed as federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and that's because the loss of elderberry habitat has been pretty extensive in most of their native range. Biggest habitat threats to them are flooding, in fact flood control projects, and any other sort of riparian vegetation removal that removes elderberry plants from an area. There are species-specific mitigation measures for this species on page 11, so go ahead and take a look at those. Swainson's hawk is a medium to large size hawk. Adults can get up to 21 inches tall with a 52-inch wingspan. The plumage is usually pretty distinctive for the species. Their head feathers are going to be a dark brown, and so will most of their flight feathers, and that's going to contrast pretty sharply with a light tan underbelly and underwing plumage. But that's not always the case. Like the image in front of you, these hawks can also have a mottled underbelly, so it's a little less clear, and in some cases that mottling can go all the way to black. So most of the time these hawks are easy to pick out from, say, a red-tailed hawk. Swainson's hawks are state threatened, and they also carry federal protection in the form of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. These birds are protected because they're losing habitat and nesting areas due to agricultural development and cutting of trees for fire suppression. The breeding season for these birds starts in March through April. Females usually lay about 2 to 3 eggs by mid-May. They hatch in about 30 days, they'll fledge in 30 to 40 days, and at that point, the hawks will begin hunting in groups. They feed primarily on rodents, lizards, snakes, frogs, toads, birds, and other insects, particularly grasshoppers. There are species-specific mitigation measures for these animals, and they are located on page 13. Northwestern pond turtle is a medium-sized aquatic turtle. Their shells usually measure anywhere between 3 to 8 inches in length. They come in dark brown, olive brown, or blackish. And one of the ways of distinguishing this turtle from other turtle species is that its head usually contains a network of black spots all around, and they might even have some cream or yellow color on the underside of their heads. Northwestern pond turtle is listed as a species of special concern in California, and that's primarily due to habitat loss from wetland degradation and also urban development in their native range. As the name implies, this species is going to prefer still water like ponds, but they'll also inhabit streams and rivers. The females will climb up onto the bank of their water bodies to dig their nests. They'll usually lay about 2 to 11 eggs, sometimes 2 clutches in 1 year. This animal eats aquatic plants, invertebrates, worms, frog and salamander eggs and larvae, crayfish, carrion, and occasionally frogs and fish. There are species protection measures for this animal, and they are on page 13. Migratory and nesting birds are a fairly common concern on most California construction projects, and that's because they carry with them a federal and state protection. This applies to most birds in California. In fact, practically all birds in California are protected under these two federal and state protections, with the exception of some invasive and non-native species. For the purposes of this project, the nesting season is going to be from February 1st to September 15th, and that means that we anticipate nesting to occur between those two dates, although it is possible that nesting could occur sometime outside of them. Birds can use all sorts of structures to build their nests. Some nest directly on the ground, some will use low grasses or shrubs, others will nest in trees, and in some cases birds will use man-made structures to build their nests, in particular swallows, swifts, and other birds that like cliff faces or rocky surfaces. They'll use bridges or the weep holes within bridges to construct their nests and rear their young. These birds can be pretty tolerant to human-induced noise and disturbance, so some are not very deterred by a lot of human activity. So it's important that we get deterrence up to keep these birds away as much as possible. Roosting bats are also another common consideration on construction projects in California. The state protects roosting bats in their habitat, especially maternity roosts where there are young bats being reared by their parents. And it's important that we keep an eye out for these species, especially on bridge projects. Bridges are a common habitat for most roosting bats. We have quite a few species that prefer using human structures in the area, and that includes Brazilian free-tailed bats, big brown bats, and some species that we want to look out for that are species of special concern in California are pallid bats. And there are a few species that will use trees as well, like this western red bat. Those are a little harder to spot. The bats that you'll see in bridges, they'll roost in large colonies, and they'll leave large traces, large piles of guano on the base. So those are pretty easy to spot if they've been there for a while, and those are something that we need to mitigate for if we do encounter them on the project site. Now it's time to go over the species protection measures for this project. These protection measures are designed to help minimize the chance of any take on this project. I'm only going to go over the general protection measures in this section. I'm going to leave all the species-specific measures that I referenced in the previous section up to you guys. Those page numbers are in your booklets, so please review those species protection measures. We're just going to go over the general stuff here. So if a listed or regulated species shows up on site or near the site, what we typically do is set up a protective radius, and that's a no-work buffer for that species or resource. And depending on the species, that's going to be a different sized radius. In some cases, it could be as small as 20 feet in the case of elderberry shrubs, and in some cases, it can be as large as a 250 feet no-work buffer for nesting raptors. And other species will fall somewhere in between. So I'm going to move through some of these general mitigation measures fairly quickly. I'm going to try to summarize and paraphrase as much as I can. And so starting with staging areas and site delineation, the takeaway here is that all personnel, all vehicles, and all equipment must remain within the defined work area. So that includes driving into the work area as well. You need to drive along the pre-designed and the pre-sanctioned routes for this project. In terms of flood protection, all debris that's been generated from this project has to be disposed of outside of the floodway or outside of somewhere where it could be washed into the floodway. There's a lot of in-water work involved with this project as well. So this work can't reduce channel flow or change the channel flow in a way that's going to cause damage to the existing embankment. And of course, litter and other sorts of debris, they need to be removed and put into an appropriate container. And any spills or hazardous material need to be cleaned up right away. To prevent pollutants and other hazardous materials from entering a water body, your crews will need to have BMPs in place wherever there's a chance for a spill. Any natural or man-made material associated with project activities is prohibited from entering the water or being left somewhere where it might wash into a water body. Concrete trucks need a designated washout station, and make sure that all of your vehicles and equipment are free of leaks before you use them on the project. Staging areas should be at least 50 feet from the stream channel, and refueling should take place at least 60 feet away from the stream channel. Make sure that any maintenance done on equipment is conducted and contained in areas that have no risk of flowing into water bodies. In-water work is time restricted on this project from July 16th to October 15th for the Stanislaus River, and from October 15th through February 15th on the SSJID main canal. Pile driving may only occur from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with a no work period of at least 8 hours overnight. There should be no vegetation removal outside of what is explicitly stated in the permits. Any cleared vegetation needs to be immediately removed from the floodway, and sensitive vegetation, such as elderberry plants, will be flagged for protection. As mentioned before, you should be using BMPs wherever there's a risk of project-related runoff. The BMPs must be installed before the rainy season, and they must be implemented in all areas disturbed by project activities. There are several species protection areas on this project site. Your biologist will inspect daily to make sure that compliance with the permits and regulations and specifications for this project in these species protection areas is adhered to. The biologist has the authority to immediately stop work for any activity that is not in compliance and or order any reasonable measure to avoid or minimize impacts to fish and wildlife resources. So here are a few important takeaways from this presentation. First and foremost, do not touch or approach any regulated species if you find them on site. Immediately notify your biological monitor or your biologist. As we mentioned before, active bird nests are likely to be found anywhere between February 1st and September 15th for this project. If you do spot northwestern pond turtles, you're likely going to find them on the water's edge adjacent to the Stanislaus River or in slack water along the riverbanks. Incredibly important that you stay within your designated construction zone to avoid any unnecessary take. And also keep in mind for in-water work that pile driving and post drilling have specific windows of time restrictions that need to be adhered to between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. on weekdays. Of course, if you see something on a project site over listed species or something happens, a biological related incident happens on the project, you need to immediately notify the biological monitor and your supervisor. No hazardous waste, pollutants, or debris are to enter the water bodies under any circumstances. That goes hand in hand with the next requirement, which is to maintain your BMPs and make sure they're in place wherever you're working. Last and most importantly, you and your company are wholly responsible for following the measures that are stated not only in the plaques, but also in this presentation, your biological resource information booklet, and any other permits or regulations associated with this project. I appreciate you following along with this presentation. If you have any questions about what's been covered in this presentation, your training materials, the permits, project specifications, please direct them to your on-site alluvian biologist.